Dr. Etan Nasreddin Longo is a visiting professor at Marlboro College. He is also a composer and activist, and above all else, a really sharp and original thinker. Etan has a rich and varied life, as you will discover. He also has an unorthodox perspective on America, which is worthy of consideration. Enjoy our Talking Circle interview.
There was a period of time just as my biological mother was dying. We were in New York City and we lived in public housing because we had no money at this point. It was a real riches to rags story. And we were right across the street from the music library at Lincoln Center. And I made friends with a couple graduate students at Juilliard. And in the midst of my mother's illness and a certain kind of squalid notion of New York, I would go in there, I would get a score, they'd put a recording on, and it would probably be, well, at one point, it was Endless Mahler, and I would just go, I would go into a realm of pure pattern, and it was the most it solved my soul. I've become very aware of how American I am when I'm out of the country. But when I'm in the country, I don't feel very American at all. My biological mother was a Jewish refugee from the Nazis. And my father was half Palestinian, half Ghanaian. He was educated largely in Europe, came here for graduate school, met my mother, who was scandalously his dissertation advisor. She lost her job over that, and not merely that he was a student of hers, but also she was a woman in the late 50s teaching in Chicago, and that was not, it was kind of an odd thing. I was supposed to be an early 20th century German intellectual. And it was all the arts and philosophy. That's what I got. I remember being, I think it was 5. I wanted a baseball and a bat and a glove. And I remember that being acknowledged. And what showed up was a violin, because sports were something that people who were beneath us did. We did culture, and that's what we were going to do. So, and that's just not an American act. I didn't eat with the parents until I was probably 5. I ate earlier not by myself, but with my grandmother in the kitchen. There was this real thing about until you know how to behave at the table and know which fork to use and so on and so forth, you don't eat with the adults. I was very confused because my father, who was darker than I am, had nothing nice to say about Americans who I subsequently understood as African American. I couldn't understand this because it seemed very much based on what they looked like. And he and I looked like them. So I couldn't understand why all this invective was coming out of him. It seemed, I was very confused. I was extremely confused. I was also, her family, my mother's family, were very abusive towards me, because I was literally, at the time when that mattered, illegitimate, because my parents couldn't be married legally in the United States, certainly in the state of Illinois. Not only was I illegitimate, I was Black as far as they were concerned. I was literally referred to as die Schwarze. To my face, and I knew what that meant. I was very confused and just spent a lot of time alone because the world seemed hostile. and confusing. And no matter how much I gave to thinking about it, it didn't make sense. Probably 9. My mother was in hospital. I was taken away from her. We were living in Miami at this point, and in good white American style, what I guess passed for Department of Children and Families looked at me, made a judgment, decided this is a Black child, and put me with a Black family, a Southern Black family. I had no idea what was going on. I was utterly confused. They were Christian. Everything that one would think of in a Southern Black family, they were lovely. And after I got over my confusion, I I just sort of went, oh, okay, I'm starting to get what everyone sees, that what I saw myself as and what the world saw me as were two totally different things. And I also understood there was a completely different culture to which I had never been exposed. That was lovely. Where people didn't beat their children up. They just loved them. Um, I don't know. I had brothers and sisters. I was an only child at birth. So that was peculiar. I was like, oh my God, there are other creatures running around. But it was at that time when I started understanding myself, at least situationally, as African American. Certainly in college, my understanding of that became more complicated because I literally am African American. A long time ago, I just stopped thinking I was going to fit in. All I really would like at this point is for the violence to stop. I think this is one of the most conservative and conformist countries I've ever been in. And I don't really want to engage with fitting into it. I don't ever have these feelings when I'm in France. I don't even have these feelings when I'm in Quebec. I don't really worry about fitting in anymore because fitting in presumes that there's a norm. You're fitting into something that pre-exists you. And I have no interest in that. Sure, I'm African American, but when I'm in Germany, man, I am like an old school burger. I mean, people look at me and they're like, whoa, you're like a throwback, and yeah, I own that. If you're diverse in your essence, there's not going to be any fitting in. It's not going to be possible. What norm, whatever norm you're looking at is not going to be broad enough, probably, to encompass you. So leave it. Just, I'm sort of I don't know, be there. Just be there. I mean, this happens to me around transgender issues, frankly. I do not understand, literally don't understand what people get so upset about. I I don't know, it's a human being. The human being represents themselves as whatever. Fine. What is the big deal? I mean, I have better things to worry about. I I, I don't really care. I don't get why anybody else does. And I guess I feel that way about all of this is, don't we have other things to focus on that are, I don't know. I mean, it seems a bit jejune, I guess, on my part, but I have never understood the anxiety. Americans just have an assumption of, I'm supposed to be here and you should recognize my being here as something special or in some way marked. One of my teachers in Indonesia, music teachers, said to me once, he said, you don't read as an American. And I said, what does that mean? He said, well, you're just sort of walking in and you're quiet and you don't say anything. And I said, oh, and he said, yeah, Americans always just come in and just start taking over. Most Americans that I know who go abroad perceive that they are thought of as trailblazers and iconoclasts and very active, and they're very what would the word be, forthright, and that may be true, but that's not the entire story. But at its best, I think this country does have a preoccupation with the idea that you can reinvent yourself. And that has profound implications for people who are other in some way. You know, a good example of that would be that at one point, someone who has bipolar disorder, like myself, would have been categorized as mentally disabled. And people have made a real political point of coming up with neurodivergent. And that completely changes how you think of yourself. And that, I think, is something that this country has done, sometimes to the point where I want to scream. But I think that the United States, for a lot of historical reasons, reinvents. When I was younger, I identified as Black, but I started finding that really problematic when I realized that so much of the culture that matters to me, that feels like home to me, is not merely German American, but like German. I kind of at that moment went, let's be more specific. This is too rigid, it is too binary. And I redefined myself as mixed, which felt much more fun. In fact, in the 2000 census, was that 2000? Yes. I remember, when they had a space there for writing in what your ethnicity was, and a whole bunch of us started writing in Atlantic Rimmers because we just were like, we're, taking from Paul Gilroy's book, we're all somehow about the negotiation of that ocean, of that physical space. But it felt also very liberating. I mean, it was kind of, I'm not Black, and I'm really not. It felt much more genuine. It felt more congruent, more authentic. It caused problems. It still does. Certainly in the work I do now, it causes enormous problems. People don't trust you. People could go in their own ways. I mean, if it really is about reinvention, I would say let's reinvent the whole idea of the nation, because this isn't working very well. I'm betraying myself here because I'm not particular. I mean, I've never been accused of being an optimist. And I don't feel optimistic about the future of this country. I think that it will fracture in some very strange ways because it can't physically do so. So it's not going to be like what it was in the 1860s. It's not going to be that. It can't be when Atlanta does one thing and the towns right around Atlanta do totally the opposite. That kind of physical fracturing won't happen. But I think what's going on now is we're seeing that people are moving into radically different spaces. And I actually am glad of it. I mean, I personally don't want to fight for a space in the United States. I don't want to fight. I'm not interested in fighting. I've had this conversation with people who are very laudatory, I guess, of the work that I do. And they will say, it's really, really great that you do this work. And I go, do you enjoy it? No, I don't enjoy it. There's nothing fun about this. There's nothing fun about fighting for social justice or even working for social justice. It's not fun. I want to just write symphonies. That's what I want to do. And I want to write my books on intellectual history. That's what I want to do. But in the United States, I can't do that. So I keep hoping that the country will get to some point where someone like me gets to have a life, as most Caucasians do, and not a civil rights battle. People have got to stop making decisions for others. They have got to stop thinking that their position is the only position and the only valid position. For me, I'm an educator, so I trace a lot of the current strife back to the 1970s, when public education began to be massively underfunded in this country. When courses such as a civics course became courses that dinosaurs would take. I say that these days, and it dates me when I say a civics course, because most people haven't had them. I think that one of the ways that the country is oddly unified is through its education. I think it's also the only way in which it can also fracture, which I think is a good thing, because it allows people to be who they are and not champion laws that infringe upon others in ways that they do not infringe upon they themselves. But I don't know how we're even going to do that at this point, because we've gotten so fractured. I don't think we can agree on education. Education, first of all, it just doesn't exist. That's the main point for me, is that you cannot, as a teacher, expect a minimum level of competence in pretty much anything. Education, though, is the one thing that actually brings people to a collective table. Even if that collective table is a table in which someone's over there and someone else is over there, and they're not really talking to each other, but they're all just sort of sitting there. That's the result of education, because you actually have to teach people that they are not the center of the universe, that their experience is not predominant, central, more important, any other term you want to put in here. When we get a population that can understand that, I think things will improve. And that, in a strange sense, is a kind of fracturing. When you live in a country in which people simply don't want you there, I don't know how you unify. And I frankly have no interest in unifying with that. Before Trump's election, and I cannot remember where this study comes from, but I have it written down somewhere, 30% of likely Republican voters in the state of Mississippi believe that slavery was a good idea. Almost a third. There's no unity there for me. There's no unity. I have no interest in unifying with these people. What I do have an interest in is if we could get to some level of learning where I could say, you can think what you want, but you can't actually act on that. That seems a little fantastic on my part, to believe that that's even possible right now. I'd like to not be that pessimistic, but I'm having a hard time believing that this country's anywhere near that. I think that these decades of underfunding and destroying a public education have sowed a seed that has taken root, and it's going to be quite something to dig that up. Accept someone, whether they are like you or unlike you, as fully actualized as you yourself are. And I would leave it right there and let the resonances of that live on. If you take that as the fundamental meaning, it will pervade every other statement, every other gesture from it. But if we are all working from that, there's a chance that whatever the body politic is, I think that that is an essential element of it. The separation between jobs and social life is somewhat illusory. So, given that, the desire to hang out with one's tribe, and everyone does that to some degree, can become problematic. I wouldn't say that there's anything wrong with it. I would say there are consequences. And I am not entirely certain how we confront that. The big thing that nobody ever wants to talk about in the United States, which is class, is a real problem here in terms of how in fact people define tribe. We won't talk about it as a country. If you bring it up, people accuse you of class warfare or instigating class warfare. And yet it is a prime determinant here. And what I find insufferable about the United States is we lie about it and say it's not an issue. And at least in the United Kingdom, people are honest. They're just really clear about it, you know? I can't stand it. One of the things that drives me crazy in England is everyone looks at my shoes. You meet someone, you shake hands with them, everything's lovely, and there's this surreptitious downward glance. And it finally dawned on me on like my fourth trip that people were looking at my shoes. I was like, is this like a country of foot fetishists? What is up with the damn shoes? I finally had a friend who is from Glasgow explain it. He said, oh my God, yes. He said, because you can really tell a lot about a person's class by their footwear. It's very obvious. I had no idea. I'm from Vermont. I put on shoes that are comfortable. I don't give a damn. I mean, you know, I may be going to a really important party, but it's snowing. We in the States aren't that obvious. And yet, I think that's the issue that's ripping everything up. What goes on now, you hear, oh, those elites. Well, those elites are the people who actually were able to afford a reasonable education. The split is economic. I don't get it. I mean, people vote against their own economic interests in this country all the time because they think somehow they're going to become Bill Gates, that possibility is really there for them on some level, when it is not. It is simply not going to happen. And for every I made it story, there are about 20 that are not. It's so much more complicated because of class, and further because we don't talk about it. It's considered taboo. Nobody talks about their salary. I've been in countries, people look at me, what do you mean you don't talk about your salary? I'm like, in the United States, you just never would do that. I have a very deep belief that really means rethinking the bourgeois nation. And I think it's going to fall on us to do that pretty quickly. Because, I mean, what is it? About 3 months ago, I read that man-made material had finally surpassed all natural material on the planet in terms of weight and volume, we got a problem. And it can't be that this nation thinks about getting what's its. There's no its anymore. And if we continue thinking in those ways, the species isn't going to make it. That has profound implications for questions of identity. Because if we can't do that, because the planet won't support it, and there's an awareness of that, a belief in that, the way we identify each other and ourselves has to change as well. It won't be, for instance, so strange to think of a citizen of the world.